Welcome to lecture for crisis intervention, looking at Chapter 9 of Aguilera, Life Cycle Stress. I think this reading brings up two important points about why it's important to have an awareness of the impact of human development on crises. One is noting that certain transitions in the life cycle, developmental changes or shifts, can lead to the experience of a psychological crisis. Frequently this is because the transition leads to a role change, which we've previously talked about. The other thing is the reading here kind of cues us to think about the fact that all crises, whether or not they're triggered by transitions in the life cycle, occur in some developmental context. It may be helpful to think about where a person is in his or her life cycle, where they just came from, where they're going, when trying to figure out how to best help that person. So before we talk about kind of some of the typical transitions, let's first review some of the major developmental theories, so some of the major theories about human development. Okay. Of course, Freud's psychosexual stages, a big one. You have the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stage. And the thing about Freud's theory, is all about childhood experiences are super important. They shape ultimately who you are as an adult. And also the idea that all people progress through the same stages. The stages are kind of universal, and they go through them in the same order. And the stages differ with regard to where psychosexual energy is focused, libidinal energy. So at the oral stage, the libido is focused in the mouth, and you kind of get pleasure and reduce anxiety through interaction with the world orally. Just think about breastfeeding, and then Freud talked about how the center of pleasure and anxiety reduction shifted throughout the life. And the other idea is that the big idea here is that problems at any stage can lead to fixation at that stage, where you'll continue to try to seek pleasure, reduce anxiety by focusing on that skills or coping behaviors that work during that stage. Erikson saw things a bit differently. How the psychosocial stages, which one thing comparing with Freud's much more covered much more of the lifespan. For Freud, at the genital stage, when you get kind of puberty, and then that's it. Kind of you're done. How you are as a person is done. You're shaped after childhood. No more important changes go on. Erikson's model covers all the way through older adulthood, and with the series of stages you hopefully know about: trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, and so on and so forth. So each of these, one versus the other. So trust versus mistrust, that's one stage. And for Erikson, it's less about stages, but more about the fact that individuals face different challenges, you can call them crises, at different points in their lives. The degree to which a person achieves mastery in resolving a crisis shapes their personality from that point forward. And then we also have Piaget's cognitive stages, which talk about how people's thinking changes. Right? You go from sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational to formal operational thinking. And the main thing here is just that the way in which individuals construct knowledge, the way that we construct knowledge changes as we mature. And then the last theory, just kind of remind you of, not a stage theory, would be Bowlby's attachment theory, which is all about parenting behaviors or caregiver behaviors, and how those things are related to security of attachment. Right? The idea being that early interactions with the primary caregiver shape the way a person views herself or himself, others, and the world. And it shapes these kind of schema even before infants are able to kind of think about these things the way that we, think about them. So at a very kind of primal level, shapes your sense of security or insecurity with yourself and with others, in terms of getting your needs met and your self-worth and the world is a safe place or a dangerous place. All those feelings and ideas, and they really are kind of tied together cognitively and emotionally, boldly thought were profoundly influenced by early experiences. And some people would say early as in first 3 months. A less extreme view would be the first 3 years. But still, however you want to look at it, early on, those interactions really important in shaping the way you see the world. Now let's look at some different phases of life. So we look at infancy and early childhood, some important transitions that might lead to crises, and we often don't think about crises for these little kiddos, but it's possible. And one transition obviously would be weaning, and this, according to, especially from kind of a psychoanalytic point of view, it's more than just about eating. And the way to kind of wrap your head around this, try to think about what the world is like from an infant's perspective, and how the world changes during weaning. Your way of getting sustenance is tied to close physical contact with this mother figure. It's warm and secure and safe, and it also makes the hungry feelings inside your stomach go away. And then at some point, you're told, okay, no, you can't have that anymore. You can still make the hungry feeling in your stomach go away, but without all the other associated stimuli that you learn to pair with reducing your hunger. So if weaning doesn't go well, if it's maybe done too soon or too late, it might lead to kind of a crisis for a child. But the fortunate thing for us is that kids are pretty resilient, and even if you kind of screw things up, you don't do things the optimal way, as long as you do things good enough, as long as you still feed the kids somehow, they're probably going to be fine. The other kind of big transition for early childhood would be toilet training, which again, from a psychoanalytic perspective, is all about control. So exerting external control on a child, making them go to the bathroom with the hopes that they'll internalize that and use some self-control themselves to control when they go to the bathroom. Important things to think about in terms of kind of developmental context. So if a client is a young child, what's going on with them cognitively, they're in the sensory motor stage, maybe into pre-operational stage, maybe even into kind of early childhood. Sensory motor is 0 to 2, pre-operational starts after 2. So still kind of, when I think of, especially sensory motor, primitive thinking compared to adult thinking, but not stupid thinking. There's even early evidence of some pretty interesting associative learning that goes on with very young infants, where they know their environment, and they figure out ways to act on their environment, and in ways of trying to make it more predictable. One early learning study found that they were trying to train a kid, kind of think about your Pavlovian stuff, to kick his leg, and when he did, he was tied to a string that would turn this mobile on. But they only did, so the kid learned that, and then they, it was always in the same crib, and they changed the bumper pad in the crib, and when they changed the bumper pad, then kicking the leg no longer made the mobile go. And the kid pretty quickly learned that and wouldn't kick his leg unless he was in the crib with the right bumper pad. So he learned, okay, kicking my leg works, and it's getting old to work in this context, but not in this context, which is a fairly impressive cognitive skill for a little bit. But still not a whole lot of kind of higher level thinking going on. Emotionally, not much self-regulation of emotions. They really rely on caregivers to help regulate their emotions. And according to some theorists, there's a process by which babies and children internalize these processes of self-regulation. So the better that adults are able to kind of help a child regulate his or her emotions, the better the child will be able to do it on his or her own later on. In terms of socially, most important relationships are with primary caregivers. obviously. Biologically, there's substantial changes physically over this period of time in terms of size, rate of growth, neural development, and then consequent changes in motor development. So a lot going on in a fairly short amount of time. If we look at pre-puberty, the really one major transition we have here for a lot of kids is going to school. And this can really lead to a crisis for some kids that that have kind of school refusal, have fear of school. It's kind of separation anxiety applied to the school context, and this can cause a lot of strain on a family. But there are things you can do to help with that, and we'll talk about those in class. In terms of developmental context, cognitively at the concrete operational stage, so if they experience some other crisis, this will affect how you can work with them. Like if they experience the loss of a loved one, because they have concrete operational thinking, their understanding of death might not be as mature as obviously as an older child. If they don't have abstract thinking, which we see in formal operational thinking, they may not understand that death is permanent. They may still believe that it is reversible. But those kind of things you can kind of assess for and ask about. Emotionally, if you've got improved self-regulation. Socially, friends are kind of more important than in earlier childhood, but they're still kind of just a source of entertainment, playmates, and still the caregivers are the most important relationship in these individuals' lives. In terms of biological development, the pace of change has slowed here, but hasn't stopped. Still growing, still developing neurologically and motorically, but there's not as much change as we had in previous stages. If we look at adolescence, a lot of transitions. We'll just talk about some of them. One of the big ones obviously being puberty. You get the development of secondary sexual characteristics. And puberty isn't necessarily induce a crisis. Not every adolescent is in crisis. They may act like it, but they're not all in crisis. It may happen in response to puberty if they're not prepared for it, if they haven't learned anything, no one's ever talked to them about the changes to expect and what it means. When your body starts changing, if you're operating in kind of this information vacuum where you don't know how to interpret it, there's potential for kind of misinterpretations that could be problematic. And also the family may not be prepared for a child to go through puberty and all the changes that involves, and the potential for to reproduce. That can lead to a crisis in some families, some kids. The major kind of crisis most people think about when talking about adolescence is the one identified, by Erickson, is this identity crisis, where you're trying to figure out who you are and where you fit in the world. And to some degree, Erickson would argue that everybody undergoes an identity crisis. Whether or not this kind of really results in a psychological crisis, the way we've been talking about it in this class, will depend on, obviously, the balancing factors that are there and how much pressure there is on an adolescent to figure out who they are. In terms of developmental context, cognitively, formal operational thinking, so able to think abstractly now, which in some ways contributes to that identity crisis. Because you're able to think abstractly, it allows you to think about really difficult existential questions that aren't easy to answer in terms of who you are and why you are where you are. Emotionally, you've got a combination of hormonal, social, and cognitive influences that lead to increased emotional expression. Adolescents are able to describe their feelings in a more complex way, and even able to talk about experiencing conflicting emotions, which is harder for prepubertal children to do. Socially, some important changes here. The peer group really increasing in importance substantially. In some ways, they may be more influential than parents in terms of like influencing risky behaviors. Empirically speaking, peer group is a better predictor of if your kid is going to smoke than any parenting behaviors. So the social group really growing in importance there. And then biologically, obviously, we talked about puberty and the changes involved with the emergence of secondary sexual characteristics. For early adulthood, again, lots of transitions possible here. A couple of the main ones we'll touch on. Focus on romantic relationships, marriage, or any other kind of union. When people begin to feel societal pressure to commit to one person, and if they are having trouble finding, the one person, or maybe they had a one person and it didn't work out, that might lead to a crisis. A related crisis would be parenthood, which we talked about before as a role change, but something that many people experience in early adulthood. And then the third major category being any kind of decisions about career or education. Through high school, it's kind of mandatory education, and after that, it's up to you if you want to go to college or start working right away, go to college and then do postgraduate work or job. And some people will experience kind of an extended identity crisis at this point, in terms of trying to figure out still who they are and what their place is in the world. In terms of developmental context, cognitively, no real kind of qualitative changes here, but knowledge continues to increase. Emotionally, we tend to see greater emotional stability in early adulthood following adolescence. Socially, one kind of interesting thing that happens is people get kind of increased power to choose their own social structure and who makes up their social world. Before this, there are some other external forces in terms of your parents or what school you go to that really may limit who you can socialize with. But once you enter adulthood, a lot of those limitations are gone, and you can choose your own niche. Biologically, most people physically peak at age 25, but few people notice that peak, and it's your potential that peaks. So some people may still get physically stronger, faster after 25. But that's probably just because they hadn't reached their full potential at 25. So for middle adulthood, again, lots of possible transitions, but some of the big ones. Career changes, which, gosh, I guess I have to say 30 years ago now. 30 years ago, multiple career changes were unlikely. Now it's the norm, and not just job changes, but full career changes where people can expect to work doing one thing for several years and then change and do a completely different job. Not uncommon at all, but may result in a crisis, especially in that interim period when one career is ending and a new one hasn't begun yet. Another one that may occur for women would be menopause, and some of the things we talked about before regarding infertility may apply here, depending on the individual. In terms of developmental context, really stability is a rule here, cognitively, emotionally, socially, and biologically, not drastic shifts. There's kind of the myth of the midlife crisis, but research seems to indicate that it's more myth than reality. There's not any more of a crisis in terms of identity and who am I at this point in time than at other kind of stages of human development. It's always a question people can be struggling with the biggest focus on that question being during adolescence. In terms of older adulthood, again, lots of potential transitions. Retirement is a big one, especially for men. Historically, their identity has been more strongly tied to work than has women's, although that's likely changing, continuing to change. And then the other one being kind of this existential crisis or existential crises. As you get older, the reality of your own death becomes more tangible, and as it happens, people tend to, it seems, grapple with the meaning of their own life. So not just the meaning of life, but what have I done? What have I? So no longer is it what's my place in the world. It's like, what have I done for this world? What's my legacy? What's the mark that I've left? And can I feel good about that, or am I going to kind of despair about that, to use Erickson's term? In terms of developmental context, cognitively, really a very slow cognitive decline began at age 25 for everybody. Kind of the speed at which your neurons can transmit information peaked at 25. But it's a very slow decline. But then the decline picks up a bit cognitively at 65. In terms of you think slower, it takes longer to make decisions. But it's not the case that everyone gets dementia. A small percentage of the population is impacted by that and other kind of cognitive disorders, but not all older adults. It's not something that, if you live long enough, you'll experience dementia. Not necessarily. There are a lot of other factors that can go into that. Emotionally, again, no great changes in terms of stability. One maybe theme that may come up here in terms of emotional experience would be anxiety or fear with kind of existential crises, or anxiety or fear about loss of independence. The idea of, well, if my health starts to fail, will I be put in a home, or will I still be able to drive? Those kind of worries start to emerge. Socially, there's a lot of variability here, but one kind of experience that's more common for older adults than for people at other points in lives is attending more funerals. So the loss of more friends, just statistically speaking, becomes a more common experience. And then biologically, as I've already said, there's this kind of slowing down that happens with some variability. Some people, that are 90 and still get around quite well, but for most individuals, motor functioning and health slowly decline, and that decline starts to pick up the more you move into older adulthood. Although that really depends on a lot of factors, not the least of which is how active you try to stay. People that don't try to stay active are more likely to kind of atrophy and slow down much more quickly. Okay, so there are lots of different transitions across the lifespan that may or may not lead to a crisis. And if we can kind of, when working with someone, if they're kind of having a lifespan crisis or any other kind of crisis, if we can kind of think about where they are developmentally, it might give us some clues as to how to better help them. So we'll talk in class about applying Aguilera's model to some of these transitional life cycle crises, and I want you to be thinking about what perceptions, how perceptions of the event might differ in terms of an adolescent going through puberty versus an older adult experiencing retirement. Okay, so we'll talk about the perception of the event, the situation supports, and obviously the coping behaviors.